says that 2025 is not yet done with claiming cinematic legends, as after the death of Robert Redford, we heard yesterday that cinematic legend and Japanese great Tatsuya Nakadai passed away at the ripe old age of 92. Nakadai, along with Toshiro Mifune, came to represent the golden age of Japanese cinema. Along with directors like Ozu, Kobayashi, Kurosawa, these were the very pillars on which Japanese cinema stood. Japanese cinema, right after World War II, in that après-guerre era, had a lot to deal with. But it is credit to the filmmakers of that time and to these actors that in the ruins of Imperial Japan, they were able to find a cinematic voice that stands to this very day. The period itself lasted for about almost 30 years, from the early 50s all the way up to the 80s. And Nakadai was there for most of it. Though in semi-retirement, he was appearing in the occasional film here and there as he got older. I think it was the period from when he was first discovered and worked with Masaki Kobayashi on the seminal The Human Condition, that trilogy, which launched him. I think it was that, all the way up to Kurosawa's Ran, that really represented, his most significant works. In speaking about Nakadai, I feel that I must also speak about Toshiro Mifune, who often appears in the background here at the last picture show. Both not professional actors, but discovered by people who understood that they had talents and that they were diamonds in the rough, and that with the right society, with the right sort of people to work with, and in, of course, both cases, they got to work with Kurosawa and Kobayashi. There was potentially legends on hand. And that's exactly what these two would go on to become. If Mifune embodied the otokorashi, as they would often describe him, that man of martial vigor, a man's man, I think it is Nakadai who had more nuance to his maleness, more facets to who he was, both as an actor as well as the characters that he would often present on screen. I got to see him first in one of my all-time favorite movies, Yojimbo, which of course starred Toshiro Mifune as protagonist, directed by Akira Kurosawa, in which he plays the villainous Ushitora. The movie in itself is one of the greats of cinema, not only because it was able to take the Western genre of cowboys and Indians and transplant it to Japan and make it its own sort of comment on samurais, the Meiji Restoration, and modern Japan. But it would also go on to reinvigorate the Western genre itself, as movies like Yojimbo went on to inspire most of, or at least some of, Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns. I pause because there's several moments, because I almost know Yojimbo by heart. There are several moments in Yojimbo which of course are perfect showcases for Mifune, but then equally for Nakadai himself. As much as they both had very storied careers, the reason why I find Nakadai to be perhaps an actor with more range, maybe, or perhaps more facets to him, more stuff that he could sort of unlock and present on screen. I find it in this very first, sort of my first interaction, if you will, with him. And that is because he played a villainous character, a low-down scoundrel. In the movie, of course, Mifune is the Ronin almost without a name, Sanjuro, and Nakadai plays the brattish, prodigal son, returning to his crime family in a town that the authorities have long forgotten. And they are now sort of ruling through terror and, of course, the six-gun shooter. There's this look that he has that he repeats again in Sword of Doom. For a man like that, who is, of course, handsome, it sort of bears the soul of someone who imparts sort of mischievous, malevolent, and sort of like, a downright sort of like, parcel, like somebody who you really don't want to cross. And it is in that last moment where Mifune, after having been beat down, returns back to the town to save his friend, the innkeeper. And you have that wonderful shot of that Mexican standoff between Mifune, lone samurai, and of course, Nakadai's gang. And as they slowly walk towards one another, Nakadai, of course, pulls out his six-gun, this sort of like, representation of the sort of new Japan that the Meiji Restoration wished to embrace. Of course, Mifune does away with them with deft and vigor. And as Nakadai is lying there in a pool of his own blood, he turns towards Mifune and says, of course, I'm getting the Japanese wrong, and please correct me, but he goes, "Oh, Sampi," or something like that. And I think the translation would be, scum samurai or something like that. And he'd be like, "I'll be waiting for you at the gates of hell." And then he dies. This, of course, as he tries to pull a quick one right in those last moments of trying to shoot him when he says that, "Please draw closer. I would like to hold my gun as I die." That is, of course, Nakadai as the villain. But we see him in so many roles after the fact as Nakadai, the hero. And then, well, that's, what at least my, if not definitive list, but my list is going to be today, where we're going to be able to go through a couple of his movies. There are, of course, going to be some omissions because I haven't seen all of them, but at least all of the, I'm not going to say all of the more important ones, but at least all of the ones that I like, I'll be just talking about today. So we cannot talk about Yojimbo without talking about two other very different takes on the Jidaigeki, on samurai films, and of course the values as represented by Bushido, or as what's it called, sort of was meant to be embodied by sort of like, Imperial Japan, which many of these movies were comments on. Because of course, in the wake of World War II, where that sort of Japanese war machine had almost brought Japan to the very edge of nuclear obliteration, it's not hard for us to see why filmmakers, why people like Kurosawa or Kobayashi would want to sort of question the samurai code, question sort of like, Japan as a martial race. And we saw that in two movies. Well, almost. Well, we'll include that as one as well. But let's talk about, of course, Harakiri. Harakiri is an interesting one because even though it is sort of like, I would say the ruder form of the word seppuku, it is interesting because it does, again, question that entire structure, the entire sort of the cultural and social mores of the society that sort of compel people, that sort of compelled all of these people to go and, sort of, because again, this is a comment on World War II as well. So to compel, people to go and fight while their leaders are sort of deciding their fates for them. Often, the refrain when it comes to, generals and their soldiers. But similarly in this, where you do have a Ronin played by Tatsuya Nakadai in this case, who wishes to commit ritual suicide before, of course, before the feudal lord. But before he actually does so, he requests that he first at least present his story. And the story, of course, while I will not give too much away, is about how, sort of the samurai class, or at least were often misused, or were often sort of exploited by their lords. And it is in this that we first see, while we also saw that in the Human Condition trilogy, but it is, I think, in this that we really saw a depth to Nakadai that I'm not saying that Mifune lacked, but if Mifune was the star, Nakadai was definitely the artist. Because in this, Nakadai is a father. He is someone who is visibly scarred, somebody who is sort of seeking revenge. But then, of course, there's all of these emotions. And there's often that look that he would have. It's almost stone-faced, but the eyes are so telling of this, of the character, but also the quality of this actor. So, if Harakiri presents sort of the embittered noble samurai, on the flip side then you have Sword of Doom, which was, I think by then, one of the bloodiest, at least, samurai movies to come out. And for Nakadai, who I'm not sure if he's an anti-hero or if he's the villain, because in this he is a force of nature. He is again tapping into that sort of villainous vein that he has in him, and in it, and there's many shots of this guy, he has that sort of crazed sort of look in his eyes, and he cuts his way through feudal Japan. It is it's that finale scene. I think that would stand out perhaps as it's something that we see again and again in Japanese cinema. Like, for example, 13 Assassins, or then that one shot that was done, I'm not sure when that was done. I think that was done 4 or 5 years ago, in which it's an hour and 30 minutes long. One continuous take, meant to be a legendary fight between Musashi Miyamoto and that rival gang. But in having that sort of samurai melee fight, I think that Sword of Doom was maybe one of the first to do it, and do it in such extraordinary fashion. There are such beautiful shots in Sword of Doom. We often, at least in sort of modern parlance, people often talk about, how the Koreans may frame their movies. But it was the Japanese that really, really set the tone on that. And when you have the kind of sort of iconic visuals of samurais in their sort of their period costumes, clothes, not costumes, sorry. And then, of course, the sets, and of course, just that sort of the cool factor, all of that attributes to this sort of these visuals that remain to this day sort of as just sort of, sort of the perfect frames. And thing is replete with them. What's it called? Sword of Doom. We also had him again in Samurai Rebellion, which is very close to Harakiri, in that, of course, you have Toshiro Mifune starring as well. There are two movies which I think then go on to pass into the realm of legend, because these are two movies that Nakadai did. This is interesting because the thing is that it's famously known that after 1965's Akahige, Redbeard, which was unfortunately the last time that Mifune and Kurosawa worked together they had a falling out, essentially. I won't get into the details of that because it might be spurious, but they had a falling out. And they did not work together, or maybe, and if it is to be believed, they didn't even talk to one another until the 90s. So it was a good 25 year period in which those guys were not on talking terms. So it's interesting that falling out led to Nakadai's crowning achievements, but also Kurosawa's, because it led to two movies, which I don't want to take this away from Nakadai, but I feel that if maybe they were still on talking terms, Mifune would have had those roles. The two movies in question are, of course, Kagemusha and Ran. Kurosawa had a bit of a bum period in between. I think it took. There was that period in which, for example, when I think he too suffered, having lost his partner in Mifune. He went in a direction that was a break from his usual I wouldn't say his usual movies, like that were just typically samurai films. But he went into, for example, he did the Dostoevsky's The Idiot, which is a movie that, which is a book that he apparently really liked. It wasn't very well received. And there was, and it wasn't until Dersu Uzala that he was able to sort of, find his voice again. And I think in that period with movies like Dreams and Autumn Rain? Yeah, the one with Richard Gere. I think that sort of, as his parting shots, as his farewells to cinema, Kagemusha and Ran, with, of course, an actor like Nakadai, will have gone down in history as the greatest samurai movies, ever put on screen. Kagemusha is kind of heartbreaking because in it, Nakadai, Kagemusha itself means shadow puppets, right? In it, so there is essentially, without sort of getting in too much detail in the script, about the plot, there is a samurai lord. He dies, and in order to maintain the family's position, and of course not let the rival fiefs, for example, to find out, they apparently find a body double, if you will, in the form of this thief who looks exactly like him, and sort of he is brought in to sort of play this role of what's it called, the daimyo Takeda Shinjin. It's heartbreaking because Nakadai, goes from this lowlife to this lord overnight, but he creates a bond with with his not his grandchildren, but the daimyo's grandchildren, and I remember in those moments, I'm going through the plot right now. So the thing is, he takes it on as it becomes a part of him. Like at first, he's in it simply for the money. He's simply in it for the potential reward and this life of Riley that he's now going to lead, right? But we see slowly that sort of like, the family's concerns, they slowly start to become his concerns. And it becomes a part where sort of like for him now, he has wholly embodied the character. He has wholly embodied the character that he's playing, this person, this real person. And he takes on this battle that he knows that he's not going to be able to win. And those moments are kind of heartbreaking because initially there is this resentment. Well, not a resentment. They are sort of dismissive towards him. But even there, I think slowly they come to accept him because of his own acceptance of this role and this sort of affection that he has towards the people. And I remember in particular, it's that affection that he has towards the kids, the grandkids, that again is a display of sort of tenderness that I don't think Mifune would have been able to do. I don't know. I know this sounds almost like blasphemy for it to come out of my mouth, because for me, Mifune is one of the greatest actors. But what we saw in Mifune, the kind of role that he had in Redbeard, where it was a muted, sort of scholarly, sort of wizened character, as opposed to these badass samurais that he's been playing all before. That is exactly the kind of Mifune that may have worked in this role, but unfortunately it never happened. Of course, fate had different plans. We got Nakadai instead, and of course he did swimmingly. Of course, he then follows that up, both him and Kurosawa, with Ran. Ran was, of course, I think it's fair to say, Kurosawa's swan song. And it is his adaptation of King Lear. He had adapted, of course, things many times. What's it called? Shakespeare. We had that, for example, in Throne of Blood. But it was with Ran that I think at last, as sort of Kurosawa was able to say that, was able to almost complete his oeuvre. He was able to sort of, sit back and say, you know what, I'm done. For those of you who haven't seen the movie, this is, of course, or read the play itself. This is, of course, about King Lear trying to decide who takes over next, right? It's sort of them trying to figure out, or at least him trying to figure out who is supposed to take over as the rightful heir. And in this case in particular, rightful means not, for example, the eldest son, for that matter, but more who is the best suited. And of course, he's able to blend this in with Japanese history as well. This is again equally heartbreaking because you have, I think, what was his name, Saburo? Yes. I still remember it after all these years. The king favors his youngest son, Saburo, while his other two sons are, not of the same merit. Unfortunately, he is exiled. And there is this almost odyssey where Lear, in this case, Ichimonji, that is, of course, the warlord's name, played by Nakadai, who has to sort of go beat on every door to see who will take him in. Besides, of course, this brilliant use of color that Kurosawa was able to do, because again, for the longest time, he shot in black and white. But I mean, again, this was able to, he was able to show that he understood that just as much as he did sort of shooting without it. What we get from Nakadai is a role that, again, I mean, we saw like an inkling of it with Mifune in Throne of Blood, but here we see this warlord whoever he might have been in his past is now sort of feeble. He's not the man, of course, who he was, and here he is at the mercies of his kids. He's vulnerable, and all he has is that sort of court jester. I'm forgetting. Let me see what is the court jester's name? I'm forgetting that guy's name. He has those weird Wait, I have to see. I cannot find it. Or maybe I can. I don't know. Yeah. He has those floppy, top knots, like, rabbit, like bunny ears. But that is his only companion. And you see this old man, and it sort of brings you to tears, because it's almost the story of old people who, have been thrown into like an old folks home. Kids don't care about them anymore. And they sort of go begging almost for someone to take care of them. And you see that in sort of that anguished, pained look that Nakadai has in that one particular scene when sort of the castle is on fire and he comes out, and it's this ghostly look that he has. And that's just something that I think perhaps only Nakadai could have done. I don't think, who knows? Because I'm not saying that they were almost around the same time, but I mean, Mifune was off doing Shogun. I think that was also that was mid-80s, if I'm not mistaken. And sort of this came out in 86. So, yeah, I mean, it was good to know that an actor who had lived through all of that was still around. And while, of course, older, he was still sort of a living symbol, whereas all of his contemporaries, Kurosawa, Ozu, Kobayashi, Mifune, all of these actors and filmmakers of the time had passed away. He too has now passed away, and I think that almost closes the chapter on the golden age of Japanese cinema.